Slavery in America wasn't just about racism, it was about control. Because in the late 1600s, something happened in the English colonies that terrified the ruling elite. Poor European and enslaved Africans began to unite. For a brief moment, people who had almost nothing in common found common cause. They shared anger, they shared insecurity, they shared a desire for opportunity. And if that alliance had held, the entire power structure of colonial America might have collapsed. What followed was not accidental. It was one of the most consequential political transformations in American history. This is the story of how power protects itself. Slavery did not begin in America. It did not begin in Europe. And it did not begin with race. For most of human history, slavery existed in many parts of the world: Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But it often looked very different from what we imagine today. In many societies, slavery was a social status, not a permanent identity. It was often temporary. It was not automatically passed down to children. It could end through manumission, religious conversion, military service, or repayment of debt. An enslaved person could, in some cases, eventually re-enter society. Slavery was brutal, but it was not yet racial. It was not yet permanent, and it was not yet hereditary. That would begin to change in the English Atlantic world during the 1600s. And it changed for one simple reason: incentives. The rise of plantation agriculture created a structural problem. Plantations required massive amounts of labor, not just labor, but constant, predictable, and cheap labor. In the early years, English colonies relied heavily on indentured servants from Europe. These workers signed contracts, typically lasting 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the colonies. At first, this system worked, but indentured servants had one dangerous characteristic: they became free. And when they became free, they demanded land. They competed economically. And increasingly, they became politically restless. From the perspective of the colonial elite, this created instability. Plantation capitalism needed a labor force that could not simply walk away. And so, slowly, not overnight, the system began to evolve, step by step, toward permanence, toward heredity, toward race. By the 1670s, the English colony of Virginia was already under strain. Tobacco prices were volatile, prime coastal land was largely claimed, and frontier settlers were pushing westward, where conflict with native tribes was increasing. These settlers demanded protection from the colonial government. Governor William Berkeley refused. War was expensive, trade with certain tribes was profitable, and large-scale frontier expansion threatened elite land interests near the coast. Tensions inside the colony began to rise. On one side stood the coastal elite. On the other stood frontier farmers, landless laborers, and indentured servants. Into this volatile situation stepped a young and ambitious landowner, Nathaniel Bacon. He saw opportunity. Bacon positioned himself as the defender of the frontier. He rallied frustrated farmers, discontented servants, and laborers who felt locked out of opportunity. What followed shocked the colonial leadership. Because the rebellion that emerged was not purely white, it included poor Europeans, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans. People separated by status, origin, and circumstance found common cause. They shared anger, they shared insecurity, they shared resentment toward the colonial elite. In 1676, this coalition did the unthinkable. They burned Jamestown to the ground, the capital of Virginia and the seat of colonial authority. For the ruling class, this moment was deeply alarming, not simply because of the violence, but because of the unity. The most dangerous threat to entrenched power is not rebellion, it is solidarity. Bacon's rebellion eventually collapsed. Bacon himself died, and English forces restored order. But the colonial elite had seen enough. They had witnessed what may have been the nightmare scenario: poor Europeans and enslaved Africans fighting together against the established hierarchy. If that alliance ever became stable, elite control in the colonies would become far more fragile. Something had to change, and the solution they chose would reshape American history. In the decades that followed, colonial lawmakers began to systematically harden the institution of slavery, not through one single law, but through a series of legal changes that, step by step, transformed slavery into something far more rigid, something permanent, something hereditary, something explicitly racial. Because if poor whites and enslaved Africans could be permanently divided, they could be prevented from ever uniting again. Importantly, the colonists were not operating in the dark. A working model already existed in the English Caribbean. On the island of Barbados, plantation slavery had already reached extreme levels by the mid-1600s. Barbados had become one of the wealthiest colonies in the English Empire, powered almost entirely by sugar production. Sugar required enormous amounts of labour. To maintain this system, Barbados introduced one of the most consequential legal shifts in colonial history. In 1661, enslaved Africans were formally defined as chattel property, permanent, hereditary, race-based. This legal framework created exactly what plantation elites needed: stability and predictability. Children were born into slavery. Labour became more controllable, and the white population, even the poor, was legally elevated above the enslaved. It was brutally effective, and the model would not remain confined to the Caribbean. In 1663, the English crown granted the territory that would become the Carolina colony. Many early settlers arrived directly from Barbados. They brought their plantation expertise, they brought their slave codes, and they brought the economic logic of the Caribbean sugar system. In South Carolina, the transformation of slavery accelerated rapidly. The colony developed one of the highest enslaved population ratios in North America and implemented some of the strictest slave laws on the continent. Here, the shift became unmistakable. Slavery was no longer merely a condition. It became a caste. Africans were systematically excluded from legal protection and political participation. Poor whites, meanwhile, were granted small but meaningful legal privileges. Not wealth, not real political power, but status. And status can be one of the most powerful tools of social control ever devised. Because if you can convince one group that they stand above another, they are far less likely to question those truly at the top. Race became more than prejudice. It became infrastructure, a political boundary, a social boundary, a psychological boundary, a technology of division. Before this period, alliances between poor Europeans and Africans had been possible. After this period, they became far less likely. The colonial elite had constructed a buffer, a carefully engineered social hierarchy designed to reduce the risk of cross-class solidarity, divide, and conquer. One of the oldest strategies in history. And in colonial America, it became institutionalized. For a time, the system worked. The southern colonies built an economy around plantation agriculture and enslaved labor. The northern colonies developed a different economic model centered on commerce, small farms, and early industry. Over time, these differences hardened. Two economic systems, two political cultures, two competing visions of the future, yet they remained bound within one nation. The tension grew slowly, then faster, then violently. By the mid-1800s, the United States was deeply divided along sectional lines, with slavery sitting at the center of the conflict. The divide that had once helped stabilize colonial power was now becoming a national fracture. In 1861, that fracture exploded into the Civil War, the deadliest conflict in American history. The country survived, but the scars never fully disappeared. It would be comforting to treat this story as a closed chapter, a tragic episode safely contained in the past. But the deeper lesson is more unsettling. Because powerful strategies rarely disappear once they prove effective. They evolve. Over time, the lines of division shift. Race, class, religion, politics, economics. The categories change. The language evolves. The conflicts take new forms. But the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent. A divided population is easier to govern, easier to influence, easier to control. The tools of power change. The logic of power does not. America was founded on extraordinary ideals: freedom, opportunity, and equality. And for a brief moment in the late 1600s, a different path may have been possible. A path where alliances formed across class and status. A path where unity posed a genuine threat to entrenched power. But that path was not taken, because in the short term, division was more profitable. And incentives shape history. This story is not only about slavery, it is about systems. It is about institutions. It is about the incentives that systematically guide human behavior over generations. History is rarely shaped by good intentions alone or bad intentions alone. It is shaped by structures, by feedback loops, by the incentives embedded deep inside economic and political systems. And once those systems are built, they can echo for centuries. The tools of power are rarely obvious in the moment. They often present themselves as stability, as pragmatism, as common sense. Only with distance do their full consequences become clear. The story of slavery in America remains one of the clearest examples in history of how division can be deliberately engineered, and how its effects can reverberate across generations. Because the most powerful strategy in history is not always force, it is division. And once a society is divided, the strength of the many slowly consolidates into the power of the few.